Hey, this is Ben McEwen for Aetuts, and today we're going to take a look at the popular effect from Harry Potter, which is the Priori Incantatem. I don't know how you say that, but that's how it's spelled. So let's take a look at the clip. Looks pretty sweet. So obviously, this was done by Moving Picture Company, or MPC, and you can see there's sort of particles, lightning, looks like maybe a bit of a fluid simulation going on, and we're going to try and recreate this as best we can in After Effects with the tools we have available. Now, as you can imagine, this is going to be a pretty long tutorial, so bear with me. And I've decided to try and do this in only a few takes, just so you can see the mistakes that do pop up when you're doing work that is of this complexity, because they do happen and they happen a lot. And I think it's important that people know how to go about solving these. So let's get to it. Just like magic, we're in PF Track here to match move our shot. Now, you don't have to have PF Track. Any match moving software will work. PF Match It that was revealed at SIGGRAPH when that comes out. Synthesize, Buju, PFO, whatever you can get your hands on will work. So let's get started, and we'll go File, New Shot, and we'll call this Awesome. No. Incantatem. Okay, I think that's how you spell it. Now we'll just go to the desktop for now. Okay. Now we want to import some footage, which is this one. And here's our shot here. Now we'll click load. And I want to mention this shot was from a movie called Witch Hunt, made by Matthew Ramsaw, and I'll stick a link to his website and his YouTube channel down the bottom here somewhere. And I'll put a link up here to the actual movie. Go and check his stuff out, it's pretty great. So the first thing we want to do is make sure our shot is being read into PF Track properly. So we'll right click and go Edit Format. And I know for a fact our frame rate is 25 frames a second. And we'll just keep it on PAL there. Doesn't need de-interlacing, so that looks all good. So we'll just scrub along. This is how our shot looks. You can see there's only a bit of a camera shake. We probably could fake this in After Effects, but in this case I wanted to show the workflow for 3D tracking. So the first thing I normally do is just go back to the first frame and hit track. So you can see there's lots of movement going on here. Sometimes PF Track can detect this movement, and I'll show you what happens a bit later on. But in some cases it ignores it enough to detect what's the background and what's the foreground, so you don't have to roto anything, which is awesome because everyone hates roto. So I'll just pause this whilst it finishes, and we're back. So you can see all the points down here look like they're sticking to the ground, but we've got a couple of stray points here that are moving about, and you can see they're detected as red, which means it's bad. It doesn't look like it matches the rest of the shot, so we can clean these up pretty easily. You can either right click on each point and remove from frame and forwards, and you're also going to have to remove from frame and backwards. Or you could just select your selection here and highlight and press delete. But there's tools in PF Track. You can go into tracking, clean auto feature tracks. Just turn this down and you can see over here all the bad tracks are just disappearing. Just like magic. Pretty cool. And close. So you can see there's a few tracks popping up here. PF Track sort of knows they're bad, so they're being deleted as they pop up. We've also got a few things down here popping up. So let's just do a quick solve and see what happens. And camera, automatic, and we'll just click start. Alrighty, looking at our track, you can see the grid here isn't aligned. So let's just right click on a point and set that one as the origin, and click and drag and try and align it. Right click is move around, but you should really keep that to the origin. Normal click is just rotate your grid, and mouse button is zoom. So we want to try and line it up with the horizon, and you can already see that it's probably not the best track. It's sliding around, you can see it's wiggling a bit down here. So we're going to have to take this a little bit further. So if we go camera, delete solution, yes. And whilst we're at it, we'll go tracking clear auto features. Okay. So first of all, let's just do a loose roto around our characters moving, because that's going to help us a lot. It doesn't have to be too articulate, so it shouldn't take too long. So to create a mask, we just click the mask button up here and click and drag is for Bezier points. Doesn't have to be too accurate. We want to get a little bit of the corner there. Okay, and right click to close. Now we'll just go forward a bit, like so. Just get her in the shot and try and keep as much detail as we can. Might want to fix that up. So you can see the process of me doing this. I'm going to pause and come back. Alrighty. So you can see the roto isn't that great. It's very, very loose. So the tighter you can get it, the better, but there's not really much extra detail we're missing out on. Maybe a little bit over here, but we'll take it from here. It should be good enough. So first thing I want to do is go into tracking and tracking parameters and just up the number of target features. That's going to give us a few more tracking points to play with, since it didn't really look like there was too many before. I'm also going to turn up the window width and the window height, just so it has more of an area to track per point, since in the background here there's not really much detail, and that's going to slow things down, but it'll make things better. We'll also turn the separation down just a little bit and go close, and let's try and track this one more time. So you can see where our masks are, there's no tracking points, and everything over here is a bit bigger and looks like it's sticking nicely. Same in the background. And whilst this is going, I'll explain what this green bar is. This is how good our tracking points are, and it's solid green, which is what you want to see. All the points are sticking here perfectly, and hopefully something comes that shows a little bit of a shift. I don't think it will, but if you've got yellow tracks, so sort of PF track isn't sure, or red tracks which is saying it's bad, this will dip down. It's kind of like a quality graph. So it's all green, solid, everything's spot on, which is perfect, exactly what you want. And wait till it gets to the end. This is where you start singing to yourself. And there we go. And now it's going to backtrack, which is pretty much a lot faster. It's just checking its tracks are what it says it is the first time. So you can see there's a little dip here in quality. It's still green, which is good. And this really just refines itself, which is great. Okay, this is looking pretty good. All our tracking points are sticking to where they should be for most of the time. And we can also look at the track error graph here. You can see there's a yellow line. That looks pretty good anyway. And we've got our tracking threshold down here. So basically, all the tracks with the confidence above this line won't be included in our camera solve, which is good. So we've got tons of data down here, and our track length, everything pretty much overlaps all the time, which is perfect. So it looks like we've got a good track, and we can go on to the camera solve. So I'll just switch back to the curve because it's cleaner. Go camera, camera parameters, and we just want to make sure everything here is all good. So we only have a single camera, and it is free motion. And what we want to check down here is the focal length. Now, I'm not sure what the focal length of this shot actually was, but we have a few options here. Our focal length is constant. Variable focal length would be if the shot was zooming, and yeah, that's just held to track anyway. And our focal length is unknown. And close. So what we can do to help out PFTrack is estimate our focal length. So to do that, we'll go into camera and estimate focal length, and we get this cube thing. Now, normally you might have a square object that you can match this cube up to, which will help you out, but in this case we're just going to have to guess. So if we put that down here, maybe move this one over here, this one maybe here. It's a little bit hard, but basically you want to try and make it look like this grid is sitting on the ground, and the horizon line is the same as up here. Now you don't want to make this line match up here, because then the ground will just go mental and it'll look like it's on a slope. So that looks pretty close. Just tweak it. You can see it takes a little bit of work to get. Just keep playing around. Okay, that looks good enough. So if we go back into our camera parameters, we can see that it's changed it to known, which we don't want. So if we just go to approximately known, it's going to give us a little bit of leeway, but make sure this is set to constant. So it thinks our focal length is about 16 millimeters. Okay, and close. And one more thing I like to do is just give PFTrack a bit of an idea of how the scene's orientated. Most of it's done by the estimate focal length, but it can't help to just give it more to work with. So if we click the plus on the scene orientation, click on x-axis, and now let's define what the x-axis actually is. So if we click and drag across our horizon, about that, we only really have one point for reference. Normally you have plenty, but we only have one, so that'll have to do. I always do it on a few frames, so maybe go to frame 100, do it again, frame 200. Okay, now let's do the y-axis. Jump back to the start. So the y-axis is obviously up and down, and we've got all these trees in the background that we can put our lines against. Now if you have more than one, it'll just average all the values, so the more you have, the better your accuracy will be. So just go ahead and do a couple here. Let's go back to frame 100. Do a couple more. They don't have to be exactly the same points. Okay, that looks good. And just frame 0, 200, and once more. Alright, that looks good. Now, the side note is, if you are using trees, you got to be careful that they might not be perfectly straight. Some are slanted, which looks like it could be the case in this shot, but it should be good enough to use. Okay, now let's just do the z-axis, which of course is depth. We have absolutely no depth information, so doing that's not going to help at all. And it's probably safer just to not have a z-axis and let our cube that we just drew here decide that. So one last check of the camera parameters. Everything here looks okay. Approximately known, okay. So let's hit our solve camera. We won't click high accuracy for now, and just click start. And we have our little quality graph here. Oh. Okay, cool. So it's not perfectly green, but it's green enough, and you can see it really sort of goes downhill. We've got a bit of yellow here. It should be okay, and it's finished. That was pretty quick. So the next step in the tutorial was to get that text message. Okay, so you can see this track is pretty solid. I'm pretty happy with how that's turned out, actually. So now next step is to export our track to After Effects, which is the fun part. So we'll just close that down, and we want to go to our camera object exports and right click it and go new. And we want to change this to After Effects here. Features, actually we'll go out and we'll choose a few. So we want to select, let's maybe go this one and go tag for export, and we'll set that one as the origin as well. And if we go back into here, new, so we want our tagged features, so we don't have all these little dots around here because they'll be turned into null objects. It does get messy. Scale, we'll leave it at 100, and we obviously want to export our camera. And we'll just save this one to the desktop and save. So that's done. We'll save our project, and let's jump into After Effects and let the fun begin. Alrighty, here we are in After Effects, and obviously we need to import our footage. So to do that, we can double click in our project window, and we've got our shot here in the target sequence, and I always check force alphabetical order. It's just a good habit to get into in case for some reason it isn't in alphabetical order, and open. Now target sequences always have alpha channels if they're rendered out of Maya or 3D Studio Max. In this case, it's footage that's come out of a camera. It won't have an alpha channel, so just hit ignore. And we want to go into interpret footage and make sure it's 25 frames per second like it should be. I've had to set up my After Effects to default to 25 frames per second. I think by default it's 24, but always double check anyway. And okay. So if you want to check the defaults, just go Edit, Preferences, and Import. And you can see here it's sequence footage 25 frames per second. So if you work in PAL most of the time, you'll want to have 25 frames a second, NTSC 23976 or 24. Just set it to what you normally use. It saves time. So, okay. And now let's get our camera track, which is our .ma here. So what PF track does is imports a composition, and you can see in here we've got a null object, which is the tracking point that we set as the origin and tag for export, and we also have our camera here. So if we copy that, so holding shift and clicking or control and clicking, edit, copy. Now let's drag our footage onto a new composition, and we'll name this main comp. Oops, name this one footage, and we'll name this one PF track data. We won't really need that, but it's good to keep it in here anyway. So if we click down here in our timeline and edit paste, we've got our camera in here. And you can see our null objects there, and it's sticking perfectly to that black spot on the ground. So that's exactly what we want to see. Awesome. So I guess first step is to make a ground plane. So if we go Layer, New, Solid, we'll make it black. Okay, and we want to turn it into a 3D solid and put it below this. Now I'm going to turn off this null object for the moment, and we'll lock that, and we'll also lock the camera so we can't do anything to that. Now we need our black solid here. Hit P to open up the position, and let's just move it across and back in Z space. and if we hit W, that's the shortcut for the rotate tool, and rotate it around. Now if you hold shift, it'll snap to 45-degree angles, which is really handy, but we don't really know where it is in 3D space. That looks like it should be there, but what we can do is go into the position of our null object, hit P, click position, copy, and paste. So now what that's done is we have our solid rotated, and the center of it is in the center of where our null object was previously. So that's always handy. Now if we move this across here, just to give us a bit more room, we know it is on the correct plane, and we're good to go. So if we lock that, let's call this floor solid. We'll lock that and just twirl those down. So in a minute we'll be using trapcode particular to create some particles, but first I want to create a light to emit the particles out of. So if we go layer, new light, and that'll bring up our light settings box, and we want our light type to be a spotlight. Now spotlights in particular give you a lot more control. We can use the cone angle to decide how clumpy and how stuck together the particles are, or how spread out they are when they're emitted, which is a really cool feature. So let's name this one emitter and hit OK. We'll chuck that underneath the camera and the null object, and of course we want to copy paste the position from our null object to our emitter. Okay, now let's drag it up, and we want it about here, and let's toggle these down and create another new solid. Of course we want it to be black. Okay, and in our effects and presets, let's type in particular. So first things first, we need to set our particles to emit from our light, which is pretty easy to do. We go emitter and change it to light. So if we scrub through, we can see it is emitting, and to get the cone angle things working, we need to change the direction to directional. So you can see it's pointing out in the angle that the cone is pointing. And if we click on our emitter and hit AA, that brings up all the light options. And if you play with the light angle, you can see how that spreads it out and turns it into a thin line, which is really handy. You'll see how we can use that to create a bit of variance a little bit further on in the tutorial. So back into particular, we'll rename this to particles, and let's play with some settings a bit. We don't really want the emitter to be too big. Maybe turn it down to about 35 by 35 by 35. And velocity from motion, we'll turn that down to about 7. And the rest looks okay for now. So what we want to do is just get a simple system going. So if we go back to our emitter and hit R for rotation, and we want it to randomly orientate itself, so it spins around and spits particles out around the place. So if we alt click on X rotation, and we'll just type in wiggle, open parentheses, 7,360. Now if you're not familiar with the wiggle expression, which I'm sure pretty much everybody is these days, this will randomly change our value 7 times a second and 360 pixels. And 360, as you know, is how many degrees in a circle, so that gives us one full rotation that's changing 7 times a second. So just copy that, paste it there, and paste it there. So you can see what's going on now. Particles are flying everywhere. It's starting to look pretty cool. And I think I'll just move the emitter up a little bit so our ones looks like it's colliding. Okay, so back into our particles. I'll just give us a little bit more room. And we want to give it some gravity and make it fall on our floor here. So if we scroll down to physics and change the physics model to bounce, give it a bit of gravity whilst we're here, in bounce, we've got our floor layer. Now we want to choose our floor solid here. So if we go floor solid, you can see what's happening. It's bouncing around, but in the movie, it sort of just stuck to the ground and faded out. So what we can do is change our collision event to stick, and that looks pretty cool. So we can turn the visibility for our floor off and check that out. It's pretty cool. So our light looks like it's a bit too far back in the Z space, so let's move it back here a little bit, and we also want to move it over. Now I'm not sure what's happened here. It's one of the many problems I was talking about, but PFTrack sometimes messes up its world orientation, but you can play with it and see what it does. You don't need it to be perfect XYZ. It would be handy, but that's just one of the things that happens. So that looks pretty cool. So if we go back into the particles and let's tweak this to make it look good. Let's maybe have 10 times the amount of particles. Turn up velocity random all the way. Go into our particle, let's make them a little bit smaller, or a bit smaller. Maybe make it 25% random size. Just gives it a little bit of variation, and that looks good for now. So you can see as the particles spew out, it's making this really odd pattern on the ground. So let's change that. If we scroll up to the top and alt click on our velocity, let's do another wiggle expression. So wiggle 7, because everyone knows if you make the value 7, it's just going to look awesome. And let's say maybe 70. Okay. Let's just shut off our footage for the moment so it's a bit easier to see. So you can see how it's spitting particles out, and then once every now and then it spits them higher, and it just looks awesome. Let's maybe, if we select our particles layer and hit U, let's maybe try pump it up to 100. Yeah, cool. Okay, now we'll do the same for particles per second, because sometimes that can have a bit of an interesting effect. So if we wiggle 7 times a second, and let's say 500. So sometimes it'll emit a few particles, sometimes it'll emit a huge bunch, which is pretty cool. Now we've still got a bit of the pattern here, and that's what we can change with our cone angle. So if we go back into our emitter, hit AA, and our cone angle, if we increase it, you can see it spreads out. But what else we could do is add an expression to this. So sometimes they're clumped together, sometimes they're spread out. So I like the look of about 57, of course. Now I'll click the cone angle, and once again, wiggle 7 times a second, and let's make it maybe 35. Should give us enough variance. That looks pretty sweet. So our particles seem to just be popping off, which doesn't look great. So if we go back to the particles, let's maybe change the life to be about 4 seconds, and we'll go into our opacity over life graph. If we hit tilde here, that full screens our current panel. If you're not sure, tilde is the button to the left of 1 on the numbers up the top of your keyboard, and let's just do that. So they're born at the maximum brightness, and then over time they slowly die. Maybe about that. Takes a few tries to get nice. Alright, that looks good. Now if we hit tilde again to go back, you can see they're sort of fading out a little bit, and I think I will turn down the size to maybe 1.2, and double the amount of particles. It's starting to look pretty cool. Now I'm not really liking that there's no particles coming over here. So if we change our direction to bidirectional, that'll fix that, but you can see it's just like putting a mirror down there. So if we change that back to directional, click on our emitter and duplicate it, it'll create another emitter. And if we hit U, I normally go through and just change the amount per second, which usually gives it, it's like a random seed if you're familiar with that term from 3D. If we click on our second emitter and hit R, we can always just rotate it around ourselves just to spread the particles, and you want to make sure you're doing it on the orientation. That sort of rotates the light, whereas we've got our expressions on our X, Y, and Z rotation. So that looks cool. Now it looks like our particles are flying out a little bit too much. They'd be hitting our acting talent here in the face, which looks like it could burn. And our actors aren't really acting that. So if we go back into our particles, a quick fix is to just turn up the gravity, sorry. And that's cool. So now let's go down to our rendering, and we want to make sure our motion blur is set to comp settings. We'll just enable motion blur here and in the comp, and we'll do a quick RAM preview, see how it looks. Alright, that looks pretty sweet. There's a little bit of an error at the end there where it spazzes out with the motion blur. Not sure what's going on there, but we can always fix that a little bit later down the track. So you can see it's wiggling around like with our camera motion here. It certainly looks like it's sticking in the scene. I'll just put this down to half quality, and that's probably a little bit hard to see. So since this is going to be glowing white hot later in the future and we can't even see it now, I'm just going to do a little bit of a grade on the footage to make it a little bit more apparent. So if we select our footage and just put a curves on it, bring it down, just clip the highlights a little bit. Alrighty, that's much better. Sweet. Okay, now it's time to get onto our beams. We'll come back to our clashy thing here because we need to animate when it starts on, but we'll create the beams coming out of the wands and get back to that. First things first though, I kind of want to group all this together just to keep it a little bit neater. So if we just unlock everything, and we want to make a duplicate of our camera and null object first, so we'll just put that up there, and we'll also make a duplicate of the footage, and we actually can leave that there, and just pre-compose all these. So by clicking the bottom one, holding shift, clicking the top, we want this this placeholder thing particulars created for our floor, and just control shift C to pre-compose. And let's just call this clashy thing, and we'll open the new composition this time, and okay. So what we want to do for our footage is just right click and go guide layer. Now what guide layers do is they appear in your composition, but if you render it, it'll render looking like this. So it's basically a placeholder just so you can see what you're doing. So if we're back in main comp, and it's right here.